Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our final UN Behavioral Science Week 2025 webinars. This one's on behavioral science for systemic change, thinking about local to global and global to local, and ways we can reflect upon that from a behavioral science perspective. So my name is Mary McLennan. I am Senior Advisor in Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I will come to shortly because we are coordinating Behavioral Science Week this year, bringing together 46 entities over 5 days of events, more than 60 speakers. So we are on day 5 of Behavioral Science Week, but there's lots to check out that happened over the last few days, including sessions on AI and data, also behavioral science and decision making, how to embed behavioral science into your organization. So lots there to unpack, and we have a YouTube channel with a lot of the recordings. After this, some practical case studies if you want to go deeper as well. Okay, so the Behavioral Science Group brings together over 7,000 members from more than 60 entities in 150 countries. So lots of interest when it comes to behavioral science across the UN. If you're in the UN, you can, of course, join the Behavioral Science Group. It's open to anybody. If you're outside the UN, you can also join as an observer. So if you do so, you can keep up to date with the events that we run, different updates we send about different UN entities and the work that they're doing as well. So I encourage you to join the group, and we'll put those resources, we'll put the link to join in the chat shortly. Thanks for that. So just another note here, the bigger picture when it comes to behavioral science across the UN. So behavioral science is part of this UN 2.0 quintet of change. So these are 5 areas the Secretary General has deemed important for the UN to be nimble and effective and really deliver on his ambitious agenda. So it's behavioral science, as well as data, digital transformation, innovation, and strategic foresight. So we'll explore some of these intersections today in our discussion, but I encourage you to check out the UN 2.0 resources if you want to know more about this big agenda and how it's being applied across the UN. Okay, so we already have the links in the chat for you, some of the resources, including the Secretary General's guidance note, the UN Behavioral Science Review, and many others. And also, of course, the link to join the group as well to keep up to date with what's going on across the UN following the week. Okay, so today's session, we'll hear from a panel of speakers, and we'll have a variety of perspectives. So it'll be a really dynamic and sort of changing conversation as we go, let's say. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So put them as we go throughout the session. And if you don't have one yourself, please check out the Q&A box so you can see what others are interested in, maybe you're interested in as well, and you can upvote those questions. Okay, so our panel today, we're going to hear from a variety of speakers from the UN as well as outside. So we'll hear from Benjamin Hickler from the UNICEF Innocenti Bird Lab, who's driving a lot of really interesting and advanced behavioral science work within UNICEF, one of the leaders in the UN in this space, I'd say. We'll also hear from Katarina Kwai from UNDCO. We'll speak to some of her experiences reflecting on behavioral science from the resident coordinator standpoint, and also the global resident coordinator standpoint, and what that means when we reflect upon behavioral science. We'll also hear from Francis Meyo from Busara, where he's the CEO, and he's been working for a number of years in behavioral science, particularly in the global south, and he'll offer some really interesting insights about what this means in practice, both in and outside the UN. And then we'll also hear from Sebastian Vozel from Local 2030 to share his perspective about how do we take big agendas like the SDGs and think about them in local context as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Kat for a few opening remarks from her standpoint regarding UN 2.0 and behavioral science and going global to local. Over to you.
Amazing. Good morning, early morning from New York today. My name is Kat Kwai. I'm the innovation lead at the UN Development Coordination Office. And I think I've been invited to help frame this conversation because it started as a lot of good ideas in a conversation between Mary and myself. And I think you need to maybe understand a little bit more about where I sit in the UN system. So UNDCO is the office that is charged with bringing together all the parts of the UN, 30 to 40 different agencies that work in the development space. and help to coordinate them better for effective impact at country level and to support our member states. So a large part of what we're trying to do is to make sure that 1 + 1 is greater than 2, essentially, that we are greater than the sum of our parts by combining our efforts. And that's how we tackle something as grand as the SDGs or systems change. Now, within the UN, at least, like we've come to over the last few years, especially understand that we're not going to achieve Agenda 2030 unless we take a systems approach. And it was during that mid point of the SDGs a couple years back now, the SDG summit, in which the SG launched a few very specific systems change initiatives that he dubbed the 6 global transitions. These are the changes in the way systems work globally that will define not only achieving goals or not, but really whether we're going to be living on a sustainable planet, and with a culture of peace and prosperity. So that is the ultimate goal, right? So these 6 transitions, you don't have to remember them, but just to give you a flavor of what they encompass, include like a digital transition, a transition in energy, climate biodiversity, and food systems, transition in even the way that we educate and build human capital. So these are I guess, for me, they're the need to have transitions in order to have a more sustainable future, right? So, um, a few years back, this became very much the marching orders. So how do we get the UN country teams really put together their mandates and their portfolios of projects and programs and work to really start this change at such a high level? And of course, it's and therefore this conversation about going local to global and global to local, because this change does not happen without the local movements behind it. And although it's grandiose and involves, changing global incentives and policies and new kinds of trade and economies and all of these very big picture things, the foundation is also about how do we bring everybody along with us? How do we bring different stakeholders, the private sector, to see their role in that and change their behaviors? How do we get consumers to change their behaviors around, let's say, the types of energy that they prefer to consume? So it's macro, but it's very much premised on shifts in the micro too. And I hadn't really understood that this was an active debate within the behavioral science space as well. This, I don't know if it's even a debate, but I think there's these two aspects of using the BeSci for individual level change or system level change, the so-called I-frame, S-frame dialogue. So I'm really fascinated in this session, in short, to understand better how you, my fellow panelists, approach these 2 ways of working at these 2 different levels. I have to say, as an observer from the systems change perspective, we are seeing more sort of like local movements around these big systems changes, like food systems, for example. There's something called a coalition for no, a conscious food systems alliance. And then that bit about consciousness and being very tuned to the individual and what the individual behavioral needs are, as the center of a movement for systems change, I think is really fascinating. And a few of you might be already working with something called the Inner Development Goals, which very much has the same ethos, is that, if we want to change them, something, some big things, then we have to also change ourselves as individuals, that exist within groups and organizations, and as organizations that exist within ecosystems. So very interested to hear what you've got to say about that, and also listening to the expert experiences of my panelists. And then with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mary.
Great. Thanks for that, Kat. To hear your thoughts from working with so many countries all over the world and hearing what it's like on the ground to take these big agendas and to reflect what they mean. And yes, there's lots of intersections there with behavioral science and the debates we're having in the community and how this can relate to the bigger picture across the UN too. So hopefully we'll unpack some of that over the next 45 minutes or so we have together. So thank you, Kat, for joining us. So I think you'll be with us hopefully as we go and join our discussions after we go. So thank you, Kat. So maybe just to frame some of our discussion today. So I think there are different elements of this kind of idea of global to local, local to global. So as Kat mentioned, there's these big agendas and how do we think about them in the resident coordinator offices and more local situations, but also in the behavioral science community, maybe bringing back to that. There's a lot of conversation around the IS frame, but also on just scaling and to what extent, we work in a global context in the UN. To what extent do these principles or ideas work around the world? Should we be thinking about them in different ways, in different contexts? Well, we should, but how can we start doing that? And I think those are the two things we can unpack today. So there's the big picture, global agendas and how do local contexts think about them, but then also how do we take more local ideas and scale them, thinking about the behavioral science perspective. So with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras if you'd like to join us. Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, we have Sebastian from Local 2030, Ben from UNICEF, and Francis from Busara. So we're going to ask you a series of questions here. So the first bit to just kind of orient ourselves. How have you and your experiences applied behavioral science, and what are some success stories thinking about that, particularly in the global to local, local to global context? So maybe over to Ben first to start with some reflections from UNICEF's Bird Lab.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Kat, for these opening remarks and just sort of framing the whole discussion. It's interesting to think about UNICEF's journey in mainstreaming the application of behavioral science in our work, because it does illustrate a lot of these discussions and trends around the relationship between what you might call like local activities and these big global agendas and global conversations. For UNICEF, we've been at it for a while, I would say, at least at a global level. But the earliest applications of applied behavioral science or behavioral science in the organization were organic, kind of grassroots, country office-led water and sanitation hygiene projects in the Philippines, for example, some projects around primary health in Lebanon. These were sort of pathfinding groups of individuals at the country office level who I think were just running up against the limitations of UNICEF's conventional way of approaching behavior change. And we're trying out new things and taking on board new evidence and bringing in new methodologies. So they were the real pathfinders. So it really started at a local level before it was explicitly embraced at a global level. Over the years, in kind of the timing aligns with the Secretary General's guidance note on applied behavioral science and the establishment of the Behavioral Insights Research and Design Laboratory, which is a partnership between UNICEF and Ocenti and the global leadership team of our Social and Behavior Change Network, which, so I'm co-leading this with Cash Romley, who you might have seen on Wednesday. We have a network of 500 plus social and behavior change specialists within UNICEF. And it kind of helps to understand a little bit about how UNICEF works. It's a very horizontal organization. So it has these characteristics within offices that are hierarchical, like a typical UN agency or bureaucracy. But in the end, if you're at a global level or if you're working in a headquarters position, you don't have a lot to tell country offices what to do. They set their own priorities and agendas, and they get to choose which approaches work best. So there's been this serendipitous sort of convergence of realization, I think, across the organization that has contributed to systems change and the mainstreaming of behavioral science. And it started with the realization that providing information, education, communication, some of the conventional approaches that UNICEF and our government counterparts were using to approach behavior change had limitations. They could only get us so far. And so just as some country offices started experimenting with these methods, we started to make a concerted push across the organization through the Bird Lab, through our regional offices, to mainstream and socialize evidence and methods from the behavioral sciences in our work, starting with the Social and Behavior Change Network, but also working with our sectoral program colleagues, and also looking internally at our Office of People and Culture, or otherwise known as Human Resources, looking at things like staff well-being and psychological safety, and doing things like sludge audits and looking at kind of operational efficiency. So really turning the lens inward. Yeah, and in the end, I think that perhaps like with a lot of organizations, we've realized that to be effective in our application of applied behavioral or of behavioral science, the first thing we needed to do was change our own organizational mindsets and behaviors, and also address some of these with our government counterparts and implementing partners, because our business as usual, our organizational habits, those were some of the things that were holding us back from the kind of successful application of some of these methods. Some specific examples of how the local and the global, this interplay between local and global, and in terms of kind of creating more systemic change within the organization and within our approaches, include, even as we moved away from IEC, or this inform, educate, communicate type approach, we were spending a lot of time across a lot of different contexts diagnosing the same challenges, even in a variety of places. And so, for example, issues related to uptake of primary health services in urban and peri-urban poor communities, or among newly arrived migrant populations in urban centers, the issues were the same to some extent across a lot of different contexts, but the organization's behavior didn't change. We just kept doing that diagnosis as if we were uncovering these insights afresh each time. And so what we've started to do, and working closely with Cash on this, is consolidate the lessons that we've learned across a lot of different contexts, look at the global literature, and try to identify the things that are most promising, or, and most likely to be effective to address those kinds of barriers, and then take a systematic approach to implementing, localizing, tailoring them to make sure that they're appropriate, feasible, sustainable in context, and then testing them for good applied behavioral science practice. And so again, it's just an example of the interplay between the global and the local, how it doesn't really work without both working together, and how hopefully over time some of these the evidence that we generate through some of these local projects is going to contribute to a stronger global evidence base. And just, I guess the last thing I'll say is that UNICEF is really trying to move from a projectized, really project-oriented approach to applied behavioral science. We're trying to focus a lot more on capacity building, both within the organization and among our government counterparts, and trying to avoid relationships of gap filling, and really trying to transfer capabilities to governments, or help governments establish meaningful and strategic partnerships with, for example, local universities, so that more of this capacity sits closer to the local level, so to speak. And so it's less dependent on UNICEF support and inputs and funding for specific projects, and can be more a part of just how we work and how governments approach these issues of public policy and program results, particularly for UNICEF, having to do with children's rights. So I'll pause there, and then so that others can speak.
Well, that's great, Ben. I think it's a really nice example of UNICEF's obviously a very big organization with lots of representation around the world, and how you've been able to take social and behavior change, all the colleagues, over 500 colleagues you have, to start to think about this and think about different countries and contexts, and yeah, really just reflect upon specific spaces. I think that's like the holy grail of behavioral science, to be able to take an idea and concept and test in these different countries and contexts around the world. So I think, yeah, UNICEF is really well poised to, as you said, not only be effective with this, but add to the behavioral science literature and our evidence base perhaps as well. So, and maybe I'll just open it up to Francis or Sed. But do you have anything you wanted to maybe say or comment on Ben's remarks so far. If not, that's fine. We can keep going. Or
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mary, and Ben, thanks for those remarks. I think from my end, Busara has been at this game for about 10 years, and we were founded by an academic, right? And we brought applied behavioral science to the global south, not only in Nairobi, where we're headquartered, but helped introduce it to India, helped introduce it a little bit in Latin America as well. One of the very few first studies we did in Nairobi was a stress test lab experiment. And we brought people with lab coats, right? And thought, this would represent scientists, but respondents weren't really having any of that. And were sort of looking at us and saying, why did you bring butchers along to kind of some of this work that we're doing? But I think that does represent the behavioral science and the importance of context in which we're talking about. And it's not just the setting, but it's also the strategy in which you do it. And we've moved beyond some of the academic work we do. We still provide that, but in the applied way, and I've done a lot of work in the sexual reproductive health space, we've seen examples where the biomedical community has developed products such as oral PrEP to help with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And the introduction of it, at least in Kenya, was through key populations, female sex workers. And then when they tried moving into other key populations, adults and girls, young women, there was a lot of stigma involved with it. And so you have a great product that uptake is perhaps okay, but adherence fails substantially. So the next time we had the opportunity to work with the biomedical community, developing a long-acting vaginal PrEP ring, we were able to work hand in hand on go-to-market strategies beforehand. And I think those are some of the learnings and contextualization and go-to-market strategies that are very important, right? And moving from global to local. But I'll pause there for now. I know I was just commenting on Ben's answer.
thanks.
On my side,
Yeah.
yes, on my side, can you hear me well without background?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, as you know, I just stepped out of a session that is running late and that I'm moderating, so I'm outside and with much noise behind. No, maybe just picking one, because I will have many of this very interesting presentation of Ben. Maybe just pick one. This move from a project-based to a more systemic approach, and I think this is essential because it's not only about moving behavioral science alone, but really mainstreaming it into the tools that we give to decision makers and others, especially locally contextualized, as Francis was saying, because we see from the localization perspective, and I come to it in my presentation, that most of the priorities that emerge need changes in behavior. Behaviors of citizens, of consumers, you name it, behaviors that trigger decisions in terms of mobility, food, decisions related to food, to democracy, to many different things, and there is a bit of a gap sometimes between the science, and the policy making and the decisions also of the that we need to factor in citizens' behaviors and decisions, etc., but not always the tools that are contextualized. So very happy to hear this, and of course, this is all what our understanding of behavioral science within localization is. It's all about mainstreaming behavioral science as a set of tools and approaches that can enable what localization is and mean in terms of impact.
Yeah, great for that. Thanks for that. So there's so much to unpack here in your remarks, Ben. I feel like that's the topic of our discussion today. Okay, cool. So Francis, is there anything else you wanted to add about from Busara's side, how you're exploring this topic of behavioral science overall and different levels, or no?
Yeah. No, sure, thanks. I appreciate it. For us at Busara, we believe behavioral science isn't just about individual decisions. It's about systems, as we're talking about today. So when we're talking about systemic change, how do we redesign those systems with human behavior at the core? So one example to kind of just bring this to life is a gender-based violence study we did in Guatemala. And I think we can all agree that trying to deal with gender-based violence and trying to increase screening on and reporting on gender-based violence is a good thing globally, right? But what we found, and what I think the initial folks who had proposed this policy thought would happen, was that increased reporting of gender-based violence would lead to increased convictions, which would ultimately lead to reduced contact with the perpetrators and reduce gender-based violence. But in that context, in that setting, the second that level order effects we were finding was that increased reporting actually led to increased exposure. Increased exposure actually led to increased social stigma amongst victims and survivors, which led to reduced convictions, increased retaliations from perpetrators and their families, and increased gender-based violence, right? And from a behavioral systems approach, we were able to map out some of the intervention areas where some of these pieces were failing or could be harnessed, not only from a diagnosis point of view, but also from what are the different policy options the decision makers in that space could have. And screening for gender-based violence in itself is not inherently wrong, right? But conducting it without ensuring confidentiality or safeguards against retaliation, that can do more harm than good. So that is the type of work we try and do from a systems perspective and say, if we can learn that from a gender-based violence study, how do we transfer that from a methods perspective, right? So trying to spread the gospel of behavioral system, how can we learn that from what are some conversations perhaps that can scale so that what worked in Guatemala would not necessarily work in Kenya perhaps, but then it alerts the decision makers in that space to say, this thing that's a global priority, how else can people adapt it to their own contexts as well?
Yeah, thanks for that, Francis. I think this really echoes a lot of the conversations we have at the UN, especially when colleagues are starting with behavioral science and they kind of can't really see an entry point. And I think sometimes it's literally just think about your assumptions, think about a little bit about your context. But can you reflect upon that differently? And I think it's just at the core of what behavioral science is just, even if it's you can't run an experiment, you can't do that. Can you just go to the market and try to understand a little bit about your product or your policy or program? Like that could be a place to start understand the context and where you're going with it. So yeah, I think this would resonate quite well with some of the conversations we have with colleagues about, how do I get started? What does it mean to work in this space and apply behavioral science and the importance of context? Okay, any thoughts, Ben and Seb, on on those remarks? Anything to add there? I think we're no, we're good for now. Oh, Seb, yeah. No, go for it if you wanted to. No, you're good. Okay. I think we're getting to some themes now, so I feel like we'll start to have more conversations around those. Okay, so Seb, over to you in Local 2030. How are you applying behavioral science and reflecting upon this global to local agenda and the work that you do?
Thanks, Mary. Just a little word of context. So Local 2030 is the UN system-wide platform for localizing the SDGs. Localization understood as this systemic approach of multi-level, multi-stakeholders, not only levels of public governance, but also civil society organization, private sector, youth, and all of them are part of our constituencies. We have 14 UN member entities that are working on localization, UNICEF being one. We have I will not name this 14 because it will be all my presentation, but the idea is the recognition, and I think this recognition is not only from the UN system, it's also in what we call sometimes our clients, the national governments, but also these players I've just mentioned, local and regional governments and others, the recognition that the response to systemic crisis must be systemic and must be multi-level and contextualized. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all response. We need to have it contextualized to local context, local cultures, etc., which colleagues, including Francis, already talked about before. But when you arrive at local level, or when you start from local level, because it's more a bottom-up approach, you cannot just consider the institutional part and the planning aspects and the policy making aspect and even the business models aspect. You need to also start from really local, very local, like from the individual aspect and how Francis was saying, how they act in a system and how the change in their actions and decisions in the system is changing the system itself, not alone, but contributing to change it. And so this is where we come to behavioral science, and we are not implementing ourselves directly projects, programs, or on the ground, but we are escalating and scaling up and showcasing and promoting and supporting experiences around the world, solutions around the world that are localized and in local context. One of the modalities of doing so is our local 2030 hub that are not a UN thing, but that are around the world from our constituencies. You know, these multiple players I've mentioned before in different parts of the world. They are exemplifying and walking the talk, you know, in terms of localization. One of them, and I want to come to my example without more delay, is the Paraná hub in Brazil, in the south of Brazil. The Paraná is a state of Brazil that, according to many evidence reports, etc., is doing quite well in many aspects of sustainable development comparatively. And in the civil society organizations that are part of what they call the quadruple helix, that is civil society, private sector, public or local authorities and academia, they are moving forward a project of behavioral science that is in the city port of Paranagua, and they are working with youngsters on their dreams. You know, what is your dream, and how to connect this dream to local development, you know, and local economic development. And based on this, I don't have time to go into details into how it unfolded, but it was partly based in the inner development goals that were mentioned by Kat before. Based on this, they connected it with private sector entities in the value chains, you know, local value chains within the port and within the territory, and how this could lead to partnerships and mentorship towards the realization of these dreams, but in the bigger picture of local sustainable development. So this is one example. Another one, and then I will talk about scale up. I think it's the second question, right? So I will just stop on the examples. Here in Euskadi, when I'm sitting as the head of secretariat of the local 2030 coalition, and where the secretariat is, so in Bilbao, in Basque Country in Spain, they are also moving forward an experience of engaging the citizenship within a broader vision of the future of the territory in a systemic approach into also making the decisions that correspond to their systemic aspirations, you know, and they have a program called Pact with a set of tools, etc. That, again, I don't have time to go into details, but then I will talk in the second part, I guess, about the connection between these different local experiences that I could go on explaining in different contexts, but the connection with the broader UN action at global level, right?
Great, thank you for that, Seb. It's good to hear about, you know, how we're taking these big agendas, bringing it down to local examples like in Paraná and others, and how we can reflect upon behavioral science in those contexts. All right, okay, so lots of questions. Oh, coming in. Did you want to add something?
I just wanted to mention that I think Paolo Cruz Filho, one of the person leading this in the civil society in Paraná, is maybe online. So just mentioning this, I don't want to put him on the spot, but then he can come in as the question and answer parts also to reply, because he's very knowledgeable of the thing he led.
Thanks for that. I don't think he's actually here with us today, but we can obviously connect with him if we need to. Okay, so thank you for that. So yeah, so alluding to some of the questions that are coming through, as well as like the next kind of part of this conversation, so we kind of understand where you're at. How do we take this forward? You know, what does it mean to actually go from local to global? How do we scale? How do we kind of go beyond these kind of insights that we have about the importance of these different levels? So yeah, maybe over to you, Francis, first. Like, how do you practically, you gave a few examples already, but thinking more generally, how do you practically take this agenda forward?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Mary. I think one of the biggest challenges is what I would call the scaling paradox, right? And we often try to replicate what worked elsewhere without asking why it worked, perhaps, or whether that context still holds. And there is a trade-off here between precision, right? Really deep contextual relevance, because we can't do that all the time, and prescription, which can be ready to scale solutions, right? And I think we need both, right? And we must design for adaptation rather than replication, right? So I think instead of us trying to create universal blueprints, we do need to develop what I'd call playbooks, right? That then help local actors identify which behavioral levers or which behavioral barriers may exist within their own environments and communities. And that's how we would move from insight to impact at scale, right? And I think global goals are essential, global insights are essential, but their success does depend on how they land in local systems as well. That's why I think the focus needs to be on alignment, really balancing behavioral science with local demand, building on existing momentum or systems that already exist, building on existing institutions that are already moving in the right direction. It also means trying to problem solve together, right? I think context isn't something that exists sort of as a snapshot, but it's something we continuously create and recreate with communities over time as well. And to give just a final example, perhaps, not too many, during COVID, there was a lot of perhaps pessimism around Africa's survival during that point, right? And I'm glad that the continent not only survived and thrived through that pandemic, but was able to contribute from a behavioral science perspective to the wider global community on some of the work that we've done. So Busara, together with Save the Children, together with Common Thread, we were able to publish this 18 strategies for COVID mitigation, right? And very proud that that served as an inspiration, for example, to the US CDC system. So I would say really aligning and really elevating conversations at that level.
Those are great examples, and it's COVID's a great one where everyone's thinking about the same topic and issue at the same time. And as you're talking, it's interesting. It kind of parallels some of the, well, tell me, to what extent do you think it parallels some of the conversations that we had earlier this week around sort of personalization? So maybe it takes us to another level in behavioral science. So there's global, there's local, national, and there's even personalization. And if you want to go even further into the quote unquote local at the really individual level, it's an interesting conversation throughout the week about what does behavioral science mean at all these spaces and places.
Yeah, for sure. Very quickly, I think, part of the innovation that behavioral science does provide is building behavioral profiles for people, right? So you don't need to hyper-contextualize it, but if you were to build behavioral segments, if you were to do user journeys, right? What's that pathway that you think folks will be aligned to and moving along? And then you overlay that with behavioral systems. And as you sort of try and test out all the different decision points or policy options that one may have, you're able to to better predict the future, perhaps, if you will, and you're able to guide communities and through a system and ensuring feedback loops from the community are part of the work that you're doing.
Thanks for that. I think that may actually answer one of the questions too, but how do you actually understand local context? So thanks, Francis, you got to that. And I think we're going to hear from some colleagues about foresight shortly. We might actually explore personas then too as well. So without getting too further ahead, Ben, what do you think about how do we practically do this? You gave some really interesting examples how UNICEF functions all over the world. We had a question about senior levels of UNICEF, working levels of UNICEF. How do you practically take this global to local agenda forward?
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I think about this a lot, and for me, it's clear that UNICEF has found a decent footing when it comes to more downstream applications, things that you might say, if we use this I-level, S-level framing, I think we're still doing a lot that's focused a bit more at the kind of caregiver community, rights bearer level. We're focused on things that are, shifting behaviors within the population. We do use tools like segmentation and developing profiles, and of course, common tools like behavioral mapping. But I think we have a lot more work to do at UNICEF on upstream applications, if you will, if this analogy works, on applying insights from the psychology and the behavioral sciences to policymakers and decision makers. I think to go forward, this is going to be an area where we need to invest a lot more time and energy. And I love, Francis, that you started with this scaling paradox, and this is just a really important point, because even when you have a successful project, for example, you have some real findings, and I think a conventional narrative, you take those results and you say, well, now we know that this works, and so therefore we should scale it. One, we don't necessarily, there has to be that kind of learning component and iteration and component involved in that plan to scale. So you're kind of learning while you scale and scaling while you learn. But two, I think for most UN agencies, it's not going to be UNICEF or it's going to be our government counterparts who really need to embrace the intervention or set of interventions, and they're going to be the ones that take it to scale and ensure that it's incorporated into the system and that it's sustained. And this requires, I think we need to get more savvy about how we apply behavioral science and other methods to ensure there's government ownership, that there's government involvement from the beginning, and that whatever comes out of these smaller kind of downstream or even eye-level focused projects has that buy-in, so that there is this pathway to scale via the government, at least in contexts where that's appropriate. Someone wrote in the chat something about, has UNICEF leadership really embraced this stuff? And I think we still have a long way to go on that front as well. It has been super helpful. Speaking of like global versus local, like this is where some of the stuff coming from the Executive Office of the Secretary General and this UN 2.0 business has been really helpful from my point of view, because there are people up there that's the kind of stuff that they're looking for. At the same time, we really are trying to do more showing rather than telling, and trying to do more end-to-end applied behavioral science projects so that we have results and that we can take those kinds of case studies and that case material of successes and learnings, because I think for different constituencies within UNICEF, they look to different places when they're making decisions about where to invest or what to support. And so we're trying to work, I think, on both those fronts. So those local successes are really important for us to get this global buy-in, and at the same time, this big global push that's above UNICEF has also been really helpful for us to make our case. Since we are more subject matter experts and working at more of a technical and programmatic level, we don't automatically have their ear necessarily. So we need to find every creative entry point we can to get our work in front of them and to make our priorities their priorities.
Thanks, Ben. That's super helpful, and it really echoes a lot of the experiences across the UN, which is really, you need to work with local partners, you need to work with local governments and member states to do this. Obviously, it's the way things work, and also senior levels, how to get that buy-in meaningfully. What does that mean? So we're working now to try to build behavioral science into strategic plans and try to think about more how do we into the UN and other angles as well. And we've actually had calls we developed a practitioner's guide to getting started with behavioral science, one of many behavioral science guides. But there's colleagues from member states who wanted to tailor it to their context, basically, to have a guide for them in the global south too. So anyways, there's lots there to unpack. Great. Okay, so finally over to Seb. How are you practically, thinking about working around the world, the lessons in behavioral science, going local to global? How are you doing this within Local 2030?
Yes, so without being exhaustive, because I don't have time, there's two ways of scaling up, I would say. One is more vertical, from local to global and back, and the other is more horizontal, between territories, between countries, etc. So for the first one, this is the essence of our work, is to, in a bottom-up approach, as I was saying, showcasing solutions, fostering their is the inspiration they can mean for others, to accelerate the agenda. And this is why we are one of the 12 high-impact initiatives for advancing the Agenda 2030, and I think this is a way of showcasing what's working, including when they factor in when they work better by factoring in behavioral science, and also it's an inspiration for the very UN system, because we are building capacities. We have a strong focus on capacity building to operationalize localization, and when we factor in again behavioral science, it means that we are providing capacities that are equipped with this extra mile, or with this add-on, of engaging the citizenship or the consumers in it. So this is one way of scaling it up. Another way, more horizontal, is that we foster exchanges between our constituencies, and with the UN system, we are kind of the meeting point between these national and regional and local governments, but also civil society organizations, private sector, youth, and the UN system. And doing so, I want to give two concrete examples. For instance, we have exchanges between the hubs. I will focus on the hubs because I already presented it. We are receiving, for instance, the Paraná hub, or facilitating a mission of the Paraná hub that I just mentioned here in the Basque Country. One of the agenda items, of course, there is a public-private collaboration, business partnership with businesses, partnerships between public authorities, and among all of them between academia, etc., with based on solutions to advance the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. But there is also this interest in behavioral science, because here they are working on it, as I said, but they also want to mainstream it into the administrative processes and the decision-making processes, etc., into the policy-making processes. And they want to learn from the Paraná experience that I explained, but also in general, the aspirations that this entails at a more regional, federative state level. And so this is this kind of cross-fertilization that is also a manner of scaling it up. I mentioned just these two because I already referred to it there, but there are others involving Hawaii, the Hawaii hub that is working with youth, and others. I don't want to extend too much, but these are two ways of scaling up. And as a way of a conclusion, if you allow me, if I have 1 minute more, I would say that you know, it's no time with 2030 around the corner. It's no time to start with the idea, develop it, etc., until it unfolds into concrete action. We need really to scale up solutions that exist. Otherwise, we just run out of time. And so I think that this scaling up is fundamental because it allows us to map, and this is one of our critical contributions to the Agenda 2030 as the Local 2030 Coalition, map out what exists at local level and that is working well, and that can support an acceleration of the SDGs, and scale it up, channeling finance towards it, making it connection with public policy, as Ben was saying, you know, including at national level, inspiring global strategic documents and UN work in general, to make an acceleration, an immediate acceleration in the SDGs and the Agenda 2030.
Great, thanks for that, Simon. Great examples about how we can take these local experiences and share across and take lessons learned to keep going. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to our colleague Lucia from the UN Futures Lab to share a few words from the foresight perspective. She's one of our colleagues in the UN 2.0 agenda. So Lucia, over to you for some comments and thoughts on this global local agenda, and also how foresight may be able to bring to this conversation we're having today.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for all the colleagues that were some also very, very known faces that were sharing their experiences. And I have to say, there's so many resonance with the work that we do in terms of strategic foresight and the combination with behavioral science. So I'm Lucia Soriano from the UN Futures Lab, and we were established by the Executive Office of the Secretary General in 2023. And as such, we are a global network that is driven by a global hub, and we work actually across all entities in the UN system to support the different foresight initiatives. And in that way, we actually work with some frameworks that are more at HQ level, some that are more regional, some more at country level. So in a way, many of the things that you have been mentioning, they really, as I said, really resonate in terms of I really picked 4 main things, which is in terms of assumptions, contextualization, adaptation, rather than replication, and I think, and also the point of scaling. And one of the main things that we do, one of the main projects, is actually the community of practice on strategic foresight, where we have more than 2,500 members from the UN system. And what we try to do with the community of practice is really, on one side, to make, of course, foresight more accessible, we all have the opportunity to learn from each other, but also that we can transfer the knowledge, as colleagues were also saying, from this more global level to also work that colleagues are doing more at local level. Some of the works are doing more at regional level. So really see what are the differences, because in a way is really important what Francis was saying about this point of adaptation, and I really liked it. And I think it's something we really try to do with the work we do across the system, because as I said, we work at so many different levels that one way would not fit for all. So for example, we also have this UN Strategic Foresight Guide, and with this UN Strategic Foresight Guide, we have different tools for colleagues that they can use in how to implement foresight. But the foresight guide is really put together in a way that is easy to adapt. So you can adapt to your own context. And it is something that, of course, is very necessary when you are trying to look into the future, because the future in such doesn't exist. Humans, we have a very specific way of thinking about the future. There are many differences also in terms of like how we react to change, something that we really try to see through the use of foresight. So some of the things we do see, like this really combination of behavioral science and strategic foresight, is on one side when we look, for example, into global trends, like how do we contextualize these global trends more at local level so we can really understand what are the implications, or like even when on the other way around as well, because sometimes, for example, what we also been looking more is into, we are one of the main aspects of foresight is also to start picking up like signals of change, things that might be driving change in the future. And most of the time, these signals of change are actually happening at local level. So how do we take these factors happening at local level and make sense? And what could be the implications globally? So this is also like where we try to really see, and where we try to really embed behavioral science in the work we do. So in a way, how do we contextualize the analysis that we do? How we contextualize the work we do? So also Ben was mentioning organizational culture. So like this is a big element also in our work. So when we talk about leadership buy-in, for example, like how do we bring behavioral science when we are trying to work across the system to really make this mainstream initiative foresight that bring coherence to it? Or like also like the second point, maybe before I finalize, is really how do we bring behavioral science into the foresight work to really contextualize everything that we have been analyzing. So when we bring, for example, as we're talking about trends or this, we call it like signals that we see that might be affected in the future, and we bring them at a localized level, and we create, for example, scenarios, bringing really behavioral science as well, with also like different applications of personas as well to make these scenarios more localized, more contextualized, but also that help when we are going through the work to understand what does it mean for the future, just also to help like the participants that we're working with to not have this fear about change, which is something that many times we have to deal with. So in a nutshell, like it's really like, for me, it's like foresight and behavioral science, like they really go hand in hand, and we really need behavioral science to continue doing the work, the foresight we are doing. So this was really a really great conversation to hear from everybody, from their experiences, and I'm pretty sure from the questions there will be even more use cases in the chat. So really hoping to learn more, and I would just share some links in the chat if anybody wants to have more of take a look at it. Thank you so much, Mary.
Great, thanks for that, Lucia. I think there's lots more we can explore at this intersection after behavioral science. Like we should do some more events together and do some things, maybe write some things together. So Seb, we can hear from you, but we only have a few minutes left. So if you want to maybe save your comment, we can do, if our panelists can stay a little bit, you can stay with us, Lucia, if you like. You can join us, join us for the panel discussion. Great to hear a foresight perspective. So just picking up on some of the themes in there, lots of questions in the chat. So thank you to some of the colleagues who responded already. So just, I'll turn it over to you for maybe like a minute or two remarks, minute marks each. So some of the themes in the chat or in the Q&A are thinking about how do we actually do this? There's some questions about, all these local aspects like social norms and biases. How do you practically, as a behavioral scientist, start to understand the context? There's some questions there. It's also been around how do you work with governments actually? How do you do that? You mentioned that, Ben, but more needs to happen. But how? What are some of the challenges and ways to do that, particularly if like political cycles change and things change? How would you deal with that? And then this buy-in question of what does this mean? I feel like people are like, behavioral science is obvious. Why should we not be doing it? Why do we need buy-in? So maybe there's a question of what that means, buy-in, and maybe kind of your practical challenges with that. So yeah, other than that, maybe if you pick up on any of those points there in the last minute, that would be, any comments on those? Yeah, that'd be great. Seb, yeah, please come in.
Yes, I don't see colleagues. I don't want to overlap with the. Okay, it's okay. Do I move on? Yes.
Yes, please go. Please continue.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think there is a. We talked about it last year. No, there is sometimes a lack of knowledge, and it's especially true, I would say, at local level in general about the possibilities offered by behavioral science in order to materialize the goals of a given territory, city, region. In terms of factoring in again this behavioral change that is needed, and that we just try to induce with policy making, but not necessarily with the right tools. So I think there is still an accompaniment to do in this sense. And then on the other hand, localizing behavioral science, as we were saying, localizing tools is fundamental, because localization is all about or mostly about culture. And you cannot have tools that are one size fits all. I believe, I'm not a scientist myself, you know, a behavioral scientist, but from my localization perspective, I think that you cannot have one size fits all tools. You need to adapt them, for a start, to local languages, but also to local cultures and patterns and values and ethics.
Yeah, completely. Culture is a huge part of this. Yeah, maybe over to Lucia, Ben. Francis, what do you think of these topics of how do you do this in practice? How do you understand the context? Thinking about buy-in, thinking about working with governments. Any more comments or thoughts on those topics?
I'm happy to come in, and I'll try to be really quick. Maybe just circling back, I'm almost ending with where we started, in the sense that so much of what we need to do to more effectively apply behavioral science in our work involves holding a mirror up to ourselves. This goes for UNICEF, and reflecting on our organizational habits and patterns and our usual ways of working. And I think one of the biggest challenges my colleagues in country offices have when working with governments is having governments rethink their usual way of doing things. So, you know, we often work with line ministries, and line ministries have a way of doing things. It's like, this is how things have always been done. This is the way we work with UNICEF. UNICEF will print the posters when there's a new vaccine introduction or some sort of campaign. And there's an expectation from government about what government is supposed to do and what UNICEF is supposed to do. And that can lead to challenges, and changing that is one of our big kind of change management objectives. The advantage, I guess, we have as a UN agency and as UNICEF is that we don't do anything without government, really. You know, we're never going to do a project that's not already involving the government in terms of defining, you know, what the priority is, what is the geography and population that we're really trying to focus on, what are the objectives of the initiative or project. So sort of by its nature, we always should have government buy-in, but then getting that sort of follow through once we have a proof of concept, or once we have, you know, maybe made that breakthrough in terms of interrupting organizational habits and usual ways of working, getting that follow through when everyone's busy and everyone has 100 other priorities is a challenge that, you know, we still struggle with.
Yeah, thanks for that. But maybe I can add very quickly. I think being able to add value to them, right? And I think which government does not like added revenue? And the original nudge unit, VAT, did help with tax forms and really produced value for governments, and that scaled to very many other national or subnational government units. But I think with the story of buy-in, I think being able to really demonstrate the value at a foundational level and not really think of folks have designed great programs or products, and then when you're not getting the intended results, you kind of slap on behavioral science at the end and say, just change the behavior of these people, right? They're not getting it. I think those things kind of, even if there's buy-in, tend to fail. And really, how do you create a sense of community and understanding and core that behavioral science should be at the core of program design and development in general? Thanks.
Yes, and if I may add also on that, just like, I mean, I cannot speak that much in terms of like getting the buy-in for behavioral science, but I think in terms of foresight, it's quite related. So for us, it's like, I really much agree with the point that Francis just made, but also the point of how do we start bringing, for those more challenging cases, for example, when it comes to work with the government, when do we integrate them in the process? Like sometimes maybe it makes more sense that they can be integrated early on, so they can be engaged, so they understand what we're trying to do, especially when we are working, for example, in the in the world of foresight, that we're looking into the future. So it's not like we are coming at the end, just kind of like this is already finalized, here you have, but like they have been engaged in the process. So this way of like changing the way we are working with them is also, it's going to also mitigate this fear of like, why are you changing now how we are working? Why are you telling me this now? So it's really also the point in which at which you actually are engaging them as well. I think that's also have been helpful in our work, and also when we have been working with country offices as well, like that kind of like at which moment is better the engagement. So I'm pretty sure like behavioral science has a lot of responses like what that happens, but that's just a point that definitely resonates to me.
A very good point. We talk about, I mean, some of the conversations we had across the UN, so maybe kind of zooming out a bit is, we start to think about how do we ensure that what we're doing is implemented and actually applied by the government and by the local partners, and that quote unquote buy-in is important throughout the cycle, not just to have a nice case study at the end with a good bar chart showing effectiveness. I mean, that doesn't necessarily guarantee the government will use it or the partner will use it. So yeah, exactly. Bring people along and not at the end. So that very much parallels the foresight experience. So thank you for sharing that, Lucia. Okay, so we're over time. I think we still just could get going. There are a few more questions in the chat, but thank you for joining us. This helps open up an interesting conversation in the behavioral science community as well as the UN as we reflect upon what behavioral science means and we go forward from here. Anything else for a panelist? Anything else you wanted to add before we close it out for today? Are we good? Okay. So thank you for joining us. This has been an enlightening conversation. For those of you who are asking, I think they'll probably be there. This will be recorded. It'll be on our website, and you can revisit the conversation then. Okay, well, thank you for joining us for Behavioral Science Week 2025. And yeah, hopefully see you at the next session and shortly at another webinar. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you everyone.
Bye.